Good. Well, as always, wonderful to see everyone. Faces I don't know and faces I know. Very warm welcome to you all. And I am really delighted today to welcome a really old friend and very dear friend and very close colleague, Michael Watkins. We've worked together. Michael has brought me to many different locations to work. And Michael is a professor of leadership at the IMD Business School. And he's the author of the best-selling book, The First 90 Days, which I last checked, Michael has sold 1.5 million copies, which is at least 1.4 million more than Leader as Healer. But anyway, and been translated into 23 languages. So Michael is really a profound thinker about the state of the world, about leadership, and particularly about AI, actually. So we had a beautiful meeting last week, and we decided to entitle our talk Devotion and Identity in the Age of AI. As always, we haven't planned very much, but we really trust in the flow of our dialogue. And we'll see if there's time at the end for Q&A as well. So welcome, Michael. Great to be with you again. And
Delighted to be able to spend some time with you, Nicholas. And on publishing, I joke I've written 17 books, one of which sold 1.5 million copies, and the other 16 of which sold about 15 copies each. So you gotta average it out across the entire portfolio, I think. So
so I know one of our many points in common is you've just returned from a profound trip to Milan, not to Milan, to Japan, and where you studied different disciplines and art forms. And I, of course, spent 3 memorable months with the Kodo drummers some while ago. So that might be one of the ways we start, Michael, because you sent me a beautiful piece you wrote about that journey. And many things jumped out, but particularly the word do, which I think loosely translates as the way with a
the way,
capital.
exactly, Nicholas.
So why
Yeah,
don't
so
you
super
talk about
briefly, and
that?
just as background, so I grew up in a very small town in northern Ontario. And when I was about 14, a Japanese sensei came to town and started a judo dojo. And I still don't exactly remember why I got involved, but it triggered this absolute fascination of and passion for Japan and all things Japanese.
Hmm.
And as young men do, Nicholas, as you know, I imagined myself a samurai and a true Zen warrior, and all the other things that one does when one is 14 or 15 with too much time on one's hands, right? So, but that passion lasted, right? And it's only relatively recently that I've been able to travel to Japan. But as you said, I organized, I think, a quite unique exploration as part of that trip around the idea fundamentally of do of the way.
Yes, so and in my case, I was anyway, a passionate drummer. I'd been to Africa for 6 months, and then I one day I saw Kodo in London, and I was so and Kodo means children of the drum and
Mm,
heartbeat, and I
mm.
was so moved by their performance that I went backstage afterwards and said, "Can I come and study with you?" And it took them a while because they'd never had a Westerner before. But anyway, I did go and I did spend 3 extraordinary months with them. And yeah, one of the things actually that when I read your piece and I thought about my time with Kodo and how maybe it's a way into Do, and the pronunciation is interesting because just before I went, I went to see an amazing Japanese drummer in London. And after the concert, I went up to him and I said, "I'm about to go and study with Kodo, and I'd love to be in touch when I come back." And he said, "Kodo, Kodo." And then I said, "Kodo." I said, "Ah, Kodo."
a doll.
And then he
Yes, exactly.
understood. But one of the many um, beautiful depth teachings when I studied with Kodo is the notion of ma.
Mm,
Now, you raise your arm with Kodo, you didn't play that. You raise your arm. Ma is this moment. It's the moment of emptiness before you hit the drum. And in their perspective, it's the most important moment of all
mm.
because everything stems from Ma. So I wonder if that speaks
Oh,
to you.
that no, oh no, it speaks very deeply to me, right? And I mean, you've meditated for years, and encouraged me actually, and inspired me honestly to go down this road, right? And I think that moment between, the in breath and the out breath, right? That perfect moment when silence kind of, and energy kind of stops is, I think, a fascinating part of many of these Japanese arts and ideas.
Mm,
Yeah. And also it means something again. I know you're deeply knowledgeable about the way that the Japanese think about energy too, Nicholas, right? And the energetics of things, I think is a core part of the idea of Do. I mean, judo means the
mm,
gentle way, right? And the gentleness is not the gentleness of defeat or submission, right? It is the gentleness of the absorption of energy and the redirection of energy, right? As the foundation of the approach. And so, one of the ways I got back into doing this work was really writing something about the applicability of judo principles in organizational change, right?
mm,
Because so much of the organizational change is kind of this forceful, we're going to drive this through, and not understanding the energetics
right.
of the work and how you think about, applying some of those principles to leading people through what is often profoundly difficult change was another entry point for me in this journey.
Right. Yeah. And of course, I mean, we know each other's work quite intimately in a way. And when you speak about this pushing, it's everything that I describe as the forward circle, the doing, 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 doing.
Absolutely.
Whereas Ma is the at least a moment of deep being. And high performance has to be an integration of the two. Because also you
Absolutely.
in any martial arts or in any practice of any kind, if you're constantly in that pushing, you're actually in a very limited perceptual field. And this is what's so deep in all these practices in Japan and India and everywhere, is that they invite us into a much richer dimensionality of life, which, of course, as we know in leadership and organizational change, makes a huge
Absolutely.
difference. Otherwise, we're fixated in this doing modality.
You'll also utterly exhaust yourself and others if you're in
Right.
the forward circle,
Okay. There we go.
right?
There we go.
I mean,
Exactly.
that's another sort of part of the judo principle is that you've got to fight a long match here, right? You can't afford to be
Mm,
constantly pushing an energy. You've got to pick your moments. You've got to be in the flow, right? Which is again, I think, an idea that you're deeply
yes.
knowledgeable about it, in order to be effective. And by the way, you see it in other Japanese arts too, right? I mean, a part of
Right.
what I experienced when I was in Japan was some extraordinary experience with the Japanese art of archery and
Mm,
and and Kudo, it's called. And I think that moment, very in a very similar way, when one draws the bow and holds and stops, pauses, right? The moment before the release of the arrow, that
that's,
drawing of the energy, right? That creation of the potential, and then letting
yes.
it go, I think is a related
Right.
idea.
Yeah, and I'm sure you know, because I read it when I must have been in my 20s, very famous book, Zen in the Art of
I
Archery,
would,
which is all
yeah.
about, and you completely stop thinking about the target. Everything is in the quality of that ma moment before you release the bow. So there's such a huge teaching in this for us.
Well, and it was fascinating because we had one of the very first experience we had was this sort of 13th generation, Kyudo master that we went to spend a morning with. And it turned out that his family lineage was not just about archery, it was also about kind of etiquette, court etiquette. And the perfect form is for doing almost everything, for standing, for sitting, for bowing, for, and so this extraordinary attention to the form of things, but also the beauty, right? The incredible beauty that one can bring to these activities, right? If one is mindful and truly present, right? Truly in the state of being when
Yeah.
one engages with them. Yeah.
Actually, there's something very powerful in that because it makes me think of Bach music. Because if you don't feel it, it just seems like very elegant form. But once you go
Yes.
deeper into it, you begin to realize feelingly that the form is a gateway and the perfection of the form. And like in the tea ceremony, being
Yes.
totally present in each moment of this so detailed form, like how you turn the cup and then you stir, and it takes you into basically a very altered state. Imagine, tell us about. I know you did a few tea ceremonies, so
We did, right? And that my wife and I now are doing our own little version of a tea ceremony every Saturday, right? Because of what we learned with the form. Now it's not, it's a pale imitation, obviously, but of what we saw. But we went to three separate tea ceremonies, Nicholas, and this was intentional, right? Because I think many people when they go to Japan will see a standard tea ceremony. Oh, that's very interesting, and at the show, right? And but we got to talk to these tea masters about their underlying commitment, right? And also you begin to see the variations, and also if you've witnessed two or three of these, you begin to get a sense of the beauty and the form of it, right? And how every small motion has meaning, right? And every small motion has beauty associated with it. Just the tipping of the tiny wooden pitcher against the kettle, right?
right.
So, but we also got a chance, and I think this is probably unusual, to talk to these folks about their commitment. And I mean, the most accomplished tea master we talked to, basically, she said, "Look, tea is a way of life for me, right? Tea is
Mm,
something I continue to learn about every day. I study, I think, but I commit myself to that work." And I think, maybe as we also talk about this idea of do or way,
yeah,
there's an element of lifelong learning, right? And lifelong commitment that I think is core to this. It's
right.
and so admirable, right? Just so deeply moving to me to see, for 25 years, first of all, she went into a tea school and spent 5 years
Right.
studying tea. Like,
Right.
wow, and then continues this process of self-study around chado, right? That's the term for the tea ceremony. Again, that word do comes back because it is a way. It is,
Yeah.
it is a way for her, right? It is core to the way she lives.
Yeah, it's very touching. I agree. And it also, I mean, there's a key word that you haven't mentioned yet, but we will now, which is devotion. So let's share what that means for each of us, Michael. What does devotion mean to you? Take your time.
It's funny, and I know we're going to talk about this a bit more, Nicholas, but devotion stands to me in opposition for almost everything that's happening these days in the world. You know, we sort of exist in a state of anti-devotion to things, right? The
Right.
constant, hamster wheel of activity, the
Mm,
social media world that we see, the extraordinary um, lack of compassion and attention that we're witnessing across the world these days. That there's this void of devotion, kind of, I ache, around the lack of devotion I see in the world today. And that's part of, again, what motivated me, and as I know motivated you to embark on this kind of journey, right? Because without devotion, who are we?
right.
Without a sense of commitment to something, why? What do we exist for, right? Do we just kind of, meander our way through life, So devotion to me and commitment and that sense of deep engagement, but also deeply anchored in compassion and belief and care, those are the things that really sort of speak to me around that word. And as you know, I study a lot about and write a lot about AI these days, and of course, you know, to some degree, AI is robbing people of their sense of meaning, of what they've been able to spend often decades doing. And what was beautiful about the tea ceremony and these other things I witnessed is no AI is ever going to take that away from these people, right? There's nothing about what's going on in the world that is going to rob the, you know, the tea master of the beauty and commitment of what she's doing, right? But for so many others today, and increasingly, I believe AI is going to rob people of their sense of meaning, right? What does it mean when machines can do things that we've spent decades trying to learn to do well,
Right, right.
better, better in an instant than we can? Yeah,
And rob people of their sense of meaning, and also, as we chose to put in our title, identity.
exactly.
This is a really big topic because there's something, and of course, I understand about the tea ceremony, and I would say the same about coaching because, as you know, I train coaches as part of my service in the world. And I train coaches in what I call transformational coaching, which means
Yes.
learning to function at a very deep sensibility level towards your client and how much you can feel in your client. And I read and I absolutely acknowledge that AI can do extraordinary coaching for people. However, I'm completely convinced it will never, ever be able to do the kind of coaching I'm teaching people and hopefully embodying myself. So, what does that mean then in terms of identity? We've said, and devotion is also it's interesting. I've heard it said to me sometimes, and then I'm surprised when someone says to me, "You have a huge quality of devotion." And I'm like, oh, really? And then I think about it and I realize that it's true. So we've named devotion as being a very important part of identity and ever more so in the age of AI because it's taking over so much functionality and often brilliantly. I have no doubt that AI can offer very good coaching up to a certain level. And it's growing fast,
Yeah.
you know. There was an article just the other day about it. But anyway, what else is up for you when we talk about
Oh, it's
identity? What forms
yeah.
identity? Let's
I think I view identity as the greatest gift and the greatest curse of humanity, right? And what do I mean by that, right? I
yeah,
mean, we as humans want to feel identified with something and as something, right? It's a very deep, very, very deep drive. And that can be with toxic masculinity because it gives us a sense of identity and connection and meaning. It helps us understand why, perhaps things are not, as good for us as we feel like we should be, right? I mean, we've been watching recently, my wife and I, the series Adolescence, right,
yeah,
on Netflix, right, and this extraordinary story about someone whose identity is essentially captured by this toxicity of masculinity and ultimately destroys this young man's life, right? And we see in many cases, I think, Nicholas, today that because people are disaffected, because people feel like they're on the wrong end of things, they seek a way to understand that and constitute an identity around that allows them to be manipulated, frankly, in a profoundly dangerous ways, right? Populism at its core is about the manipulation of people's sense of identity. That's
right,
what it's about at its foundation.
right,
But the other side of it, so that's the curse part. The blessing part is really that it does form a basis for us to find places to which devote ourselves individually and collectively that can create a profound sense of positive meaning, right? When I think about the community of people that practice Kudo, the archery, or Chado or judo for that matter, right? There's a shared sense of commitment to trying to engage in a lifelong journey,
Mm.
right? That is deeply meaningful, right? Helps constitute one's sense of identity in the world. And so this human capacity or need, probably more deeply, right, to have a sense of identity, to
Mm.
feel that we are something other than just simply motes in the in the stream. I think it is and I think that links then very deeply to devotion, right? The ultimate expression of identity is devotion.
Yeah.
Devotion to something beyond, simply the
So,
day-to-day of our lives.
right, right. Maybe another thing that I would add to what you're already saying, which is beautiful, um, that in our ongoing developmental journey, one thing we might say is that we gradually come towards identity that is actually not based on anything outside, which is interesting because actually then we can't be manipulated apart from anything else. So there's an idea because even when we use the word belonging a lot, and belonging sounds as if it means I need to belong to something. My experience is that at the edge of my kind of development, there is, at least at moments, a sense of a deeper kind of belonging that is not to do with anything out there. It's more like a belonging, if I would give it any word, to life itself,
Hmm.
kind of a profound level of pure being and pure sense of connection. And also, I was in London last week. And I noticed, and obviously this is because I've been meditating many, many years, and it's easier in a way to notice it in a busy place like London, that I was walking around London and I was in a huge space in myself.
Hmm.
So, and if you look at all the kind of wisdom traditions, many things they unify in, is that our attention can either be completely caught in the contents of our consciousness, or
Yes.
it can be in a place that is more like pure consciousness itself and not the content. This is widely spoken about in practice. It's also a devotion in any kind of meditative path. And I was really amazed by being in London in this way.
I think you're describing the ultimate goal or destination of pursuing a way, right? Which is the kind of profound, deep connection to yourself, to the broader field of energy in which we operate, right? And I think you hit on something I think very important there too, Nicholas, right? Which is this whole, external and a need for external validation, right?
Yeah.
Which as social creatures, it's very difficult to pull ourselves away from that, right? And so to me, the first step is if you accept that, at least in the initial phases of the journey that one is on towards this deeper sense of identity that you're talking about, some form of it,
Mm.
external validation is probably necessary. Then the choice of what external connections one makes, what community one
Mm. Mm.
connects oneself to becomes profoundly important, right?
Yes. Mm.
And becomes part of the path, right? Part of the journey that one engages in is who one decides to associate with at some level, or
For sure.
associates to neutral a word, right? To
Right.
commit oneself to being with,
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
is a crucial piece, right? And that again can be an association with toxic masculinity and these online influencers, or a populist,
Mm.
philosophy that helps you explain why, you're not getting what you think you deserve, right? Because it's their fault,
Mm.
Um,
Right.
there can be that sense of external validation, but there also can be the commitment that I saw when I was in Japan that you experienced with drumming, right? Of being part of a community that is pursuing pursuing a path towards enlightenment at a very deep and fundamental level.
Yes. Yeah, and there's a kind of wonderful paradox in that the more you commit yourself to something, the more you, in a way, you dissolve as well. So some of your individual kind of bubble of identity actually starts to melt into a deeper kind of oneness. I just noted, I mean, you spoke about the need for validation. So speaking absolutely from my experience, that I think most of us will be working our whole life to really dissolve that. I think it runs so deep in us.
Extremely deep.
I notice it still in myself. It's much less than it was 5 years ago, but it's a very, very deep because it goes right back to childhood when we had to fit in. We had to fit in, and we needed to know that we were fitting in. I mean, literally on an existential level. So that goes very, very deep inside us.
Well,
Something,
and the conditioning, right, that one acquires as part of that, right, I
yeah,
think is
right.
my wife Katja is also a coach, and she recently wrote a book called Uncaged, right,
Mm,
which we've talked about, which is really about that early conditioning, right,
yes,
that one acquires and how it fundamentally cages us, right, and the journey again to a form of liberation from that is part of the story here,
yeah.
for sure.
And a devotional path, as I think we both agree, is a core element of a path of liberation. Interestingly, because the paradox is that I know some people think of devotion as meaning you're imprisoning yourself, but it's actually the opposite.
It's exactly the opposite, right?
So let's speak a bit, Michael, about um, how we see why we see this as so important for leadership now. I mean, you've been, to my mind, you were prophetic long before many people about the times we're living in. I know you've
Yeah,
seen coming long, but I knew that we were heading in a very troubled direction, but
yeah,
you saw it in much more detail. You're very actively concerned with it now. You write amazingly about it. We are in this huge polycrisis that has many dimensions and seemingly getting more and more out of control week by week. So why is what we're saying so important? You now within DAW, I know you sent me a beautiful writing, and you spoke about four things: purpose, path, practice, and people. So let's jump into any one of those, but let's
yeah.
in the context of leadership, because we're both so committed to helping improve leadership.
Absolutely.
So
Well,
yeah,
this is a journey that both of us have been on, Nicholas, right? In terms of trying to help leaders deal with the realities of the profound, set of crises that, we know are, present with us, right? I mean, like you, I work with senior leaders, right? And I've never seen a time when they're struggling more than they are today, right?
absolutely.
In many, many, many years of doing this work, there's never been the level of pressure, there's never been the level of fear, right? I mean, you talk about emotion and suppression of emotion and fear, right? Well, fear is becoming so present that suppression is not necessarily even possible, right? But an eruption is possible, right? And dislocation is possible. And so how do we help leaders navigate through these extraordinary times? There was an article in the Wall Street Journal, not a publication I spend a lot of time reading in general, but we don't need to go there, right? About how many an unprecedented number of CEOs are just checking out. They're just
Well,
checking out, right?
really,
Because they've made their money, because they don't want to do this to themselves anymore. They're just saying, I've had it, I'm done, right? And at one level, you think, okay, hey, good for you, right? You've done your part. On the other hand, the process of checking out for leaders is extraordinarily dangerous for us, right? It's just, okay, I'm done. There's nothing more I can do, right? The world is going where it's going. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, right? It's kind of that sort of attitude. I'm heading for the the islands in my home or my little compound who await whatever, is destined for us, right? But I think like you, I think trying to find very concrete, practical ways that leaders can navigate through this time, right? And I think, one core piece of that has been all the work that you've done around the leader as healer. And what does that fundamentally mean at a very deep level to move one's consciousness in the direction of doing that? I mean, I would, when I first heard you talk about being and doing,
Mm,
I mean, the current set of crises is only generating more and more doing,
exactly.
more and more action, more and more reaction, more and more crisis, more and more, but it's not the answer, right? We know it's not the answer. It
No,
doesn't help. It
no.
doesn't solve anything in the end, right? So I think that's, I think those are some of the foundations.
Mm,
How do we help leaders? I'm thinking a lot of these days about the inherent tensions that leaders are facing and trying to balance, right? And the difference between trying to solve problems as opposed to manage these fundamental tensions, these inescapable, you know, uh, pressures that we face. And how do you help leaders exist in a state of productive friction, right? Rather than trying to drive for the solution, the answer, the problem, right? How do you talk about this? How do you hold that space? How do leaders hold the space within which, those tensions can be surfaced and discussed and creative answers begin to emerge? It's
yeah.
those sorts of things that I think are going to fundamentally help in the end. How do you help leaders pause?
Well, yeah.
you know
Okay.
just reflective restraint, right, is the way I describe it these days, with your ability to just simply pause,
Yeah.
stop, right, so I think some of the answer lies there. Some of the answer, though, also goes back to, I think, our conversation about identity and
Mm,
devotion, right? You mentioned that, as you know, I was originally trained as an engineer, Nicholas, and I describe myself as a recovering engineer, right? And the recovery process, goes on, right? But very early on, I just realized that the inherently technical and mathematical, which I was very, very good at, was not terribly satisfying to me in the end, right? So it's been this journey away from that to these kinds of deeper senses of meaning and attention, right? Of the kinds of things we're sort of talking about. On the other hand, being an engineer, I'm reasonably good at creating frameworks and concepts and stuff. And I try to restrain myself to a degree, right? But I think in this case, when I started to reflect deeply on the nature of the way or do and trying
yes.
to understand what I was seeing in these key masters and archery masters, and I told you
Mm,
this, we had a wonderful experience with a uh, traditional Japanese comic theater, right, where we
mm.
spent a
Okay.
morning with a practitioner.
Yeah.
Kyogen, it's called Kyogen, right? And but it was the same thing. You saw this extraordinary kind of devotion to this particular way of being, in this case, a way of entertaining, right? That had thoroughly profound meaning for the people that were doing it. So you described the four parts that I came away thinking about, right? Um, Purpose, right? Why? Why are we doing what we're
Mm,
doing at a fundamental level, right? What
fundamental.
is the why? What is the why? Which, by the way, connects deeply to, work on organizational change. Simon Sinek's start with why. If
Mm,
you can't help people understand why you're taking them on the journey that they're on, they're going to be disoriented, they're going to be confused, they're going to be afraid, they're going to be resistant, right? So part of the idea of do, I think, is the idea of purpose. But that's not enough, right? There also has to be path and practice, right?
mm.
What I witnessed, you know, was the lifelong journey, right? Which I know you're personally committed to that lifelong journey, right? Of exploration and understanding. There's practice, right? You have to be engaged in a set of practices that move you
Mm.
forward down the
Yes.
path. And then people is the community of which you're part, right? I think that, I think at the ultimate state of evolution, right, where consciousnesses are enlarged to a large extent, but that community of which we are part remains important, right?
Hmm.
There's an old saying, there's a saying, it's attributed, I think, to Jim Rohn, but it's, you are the average of the five people you spend the most time with, right? The people you decide to be with profoundly shape who we are, right? And it goes back to, being selective, about who you associate with. So it's that kind of, and the connection to leadership then is, I would want leaders to feel like leadership today is a way. It's something they need to pursue with purpose, right?
Right.
With a growth mindset of
Yeah.
the path they're on, with a set of practices they engage with a community of people they can connect with. Yeah. Because the other thing, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about this, Nicholas, is just how isolated people feel today,
Oh,
how
okay.
alone people feel today.
Yeah.
Leaders, I mean, right?
Yeah. Wow. Well, you're saying so many rich things, Michael. Let me come in on one or two. But first of all, I want to just imagine for a moment the CEO who's checked out. I didn't know that was happening. I guess it shouldn't be surprising. Because when I imagine that person, and I can understand why they would check out, my sense is that she or he is unlikely to find deep satisfaction. Because in a way, I suppose, I know maybe wrong, maybe it's not true for everyone, but because they're kind of stepping out of the game. And it's the game that, however challenging it is what makes life really meaningful. And how we navigate that game is not quite the right word. Of course, um, that scenario that we're all in of huge challenge. Um, and I think the more you talk, the more I'm coming back to, or not even coming back to, the more I'm seeing the link with Do and the link with what we were talking about before. Because one of the fundamental things you said very early on there, for a leader, is what does it mean to really hold space? That really holds space. Now, that's a very mature, that only comes with a lot of inner development. First of all, I need to be fully embodied. I mean, we know what that, we could talk forever about that. Um,
Exactly.
sorry?
Exactly. No,
Yeah.
I'm agreeing with you.
So it also means that, again, it also links back to what I was saying about identity, that the more I'm residing in a deeper and deeper space, a deeper and deeper interior, first of all, I have more room for everything. And secondly, ideally, I become gradually less reactive. That's holding space, because then we have also in the way, the Wu way, which is the not doing way. Because what, in my experience, and this is really kind of advanced, but I do find ways of going there with teams. The more we can purely hold space without acting for a bit, which means being willing to include as much of it as we're able to, meaning all the sensations, all the fears, all the thoughts, all the impulses. And we say, whoa, let's together be fully present with those. It's amazing what happens then. But it's
I was going to say, you must completely blow their minds when you do that.
no, we'll have to go there, guys. But it's the opposite of, as you said, the doing, 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 doing. But one of the first reasons people won't stop the doing is of how much anxiety they feel when they do. So that's the first
Exactly.
thing we have to address. Actually, it's okay to feel anxious, and let's make a space where it's okay to feel it, not fix it. Because even that brings often a huge shift in people. Huge shift in there. I see it at the IMD sometimes. The second day, it's fascinating after we go through kind of emotional threshold. People are sitting differently. It's very interesting because this is somatic. We don't get there through thinking. And you actually see people's bodies have changed.
Oh, 100%. Right. Maybe just for the audience. So I teach a program at IMD called Transition to Business Leadership, and Nicholas, basically plays an incredibly important part in that program because we kind of start out with this very more technical, rational, and then we evolve and get them to know each other sufficiently that you come in and do this profound piece of work with them, right? And and we often see the pattern you're describing, right? Which is at the end of the it's a 2-day process. At the end of the first day, they're very uncomfortable. They may be resistant, they may be reactive, right? And you get them to do some work overnight, and the next morning it's like, wow, what happened? Like, whoa. And you see it, right? You see it in them physically, but you also see it in them just
Yeah, and
spiritually and stuff like that.
here's one thing that captures this perfectly. In one of the recent programs, on the second day, one of the senior Saudi leaders came up to me at lunchtime. He was one that he said, Nicholas, I want to tell you honestly, yesterday I hated you. He said, I couldn't stand your slow pace.
Yes.
And then he said, Nicholas, today I love it.
Exactly.
I
But
love it.
to your point, you have to get them through the threshold to a
Yeah,
place where they can and getting them through that anxiety of
it's a
what
big
happens when
deal. It's a
when
big,
things slow is huge, right?
a huge deal, Michael. But this is an essence of what's needed now. Otherwise, as we know, so many leaders are simply reactive, and they're mainly reactive to their own anxiety. So
Yes,
actually, they're running, running, running to try and somehow not feel their anxiety, and it's kind of catastrophic. It's just creating more and more damage and less of the real solutions that are needed.
absolutely, Nicholas. And maybe just to bring back just briefly into the AI discussion too,
Yes,
right?
please.
Which of course leaders are needing to deal with as well.
Mhm.
You know, only by having a sense of devotion and identity and commitment to leadership in these very troubling times are leaders going to be able to help the many, many, many people that are going to feel enormous dislocation from what's
Right.
already happening, right? I mean, there again, just stuff I read, right? There was a great article in the Atlantic about 10 days ago about the troubling rise in unemployment rates for new graduates.
Mhm.
Right? It used to be that new graduates from, top universities, their unemployment rate was lower than the general workforce, right? Because they would come in and they would do very important foundational analysis and stuff. And in the process, they would learn what it means to be operating in a work environment and begin to build their networks and begin to constitute their identities, right? And so, the thesis, and I believe it is that they will be the first people that AI will replace. That
Mm,
work will be the
yeah,
first place. It's kind of
functional.
I when I look at AI, I look for what I call the canary in the coal mine kind of indicators that it's beginning
Yeah,
to have a profound impact. And that's one example, right? But from your own experience in the UK, what happens when youth unemployment begins to skyrocket. You've got a lot of very smart, very frustrated,
right.
unemployed young people. Where does that take us, right? And so somehow we need the leadership, you know, devotion and commitment to help people bridge through this time, Nicholas.
Yeah,
By the way, I don't pretend to have any easy answers here, right? I see truly profound challenges ahead of us, right? I was on a podcast a couple of, you know, days ago with someone who's a real expert in some of the human side of AI. And she said basically we have 2 to 3 years, right, before, you know, something really, really substantial has happened. And I pushed her a little bit on what do you see happening in 2 or 3 years? And she kind of like, she got quite uncomfortable because the answer was she saw profound dislocation within that time frame, right? But the only answer we have on in the end here is leadership, right? We need the leadership that's going to help us through these times. And that leadership is not the leadership of reaction
no,
and disconnection and fragmentation. That's not
Right.
going to take us where we need to go. We need a different kind of leadership.
Right. And it's also not the leadership based on pure strategic technical knowledge. Actually, what arises for me is a program maybe we'll co-create called The Way of Leadership. Love
Yeah,
it. Love
I
it.
love it. No, I love it. I
Because
think
I've
that
got to say,
that's
I mean, in closing, and maybe I think it'd be great to see if anyone has some questions. The way I see it and feel it is that we're in an extraordinary time, and all this huge crisis in the original, I think it's the Chinese phrase, it's a time of opportunity because it's pushing us up against such fundamental questions about what does it mean to be alive? Who are we? What are we really doing? What kind of future do we really want to create? And there is so much
absolutely.
breakdown happening that in a way it may be the only way that something really new can happen. One of the things I am seeing a lot is that very senior leaders, you spoke about the isolation, I've been aware of that for quite a while, are suddenly speaking more openly about it. That's already a huge step because the
Absolutely.
moment two or three people can sit together and share how isolated and lonely they feel, there is an inherent remedy happening in the very sharing. Previously, it would have been, how are you? I'm okay. No, actually, I'm not okay. I'm really not okay.
It's an important starting point, Nicholas,
Yeah,
for
it
sure.
really is.
Because it begins to generate the conversations that we really need to have. I
And
should
the
say, by the way, I mean that maybe this is important. I'm not a long-term pessimist about humanity,
right.
right? I'm a long-term optimist about humanity, right? But I think we're going to go through the crucible, yeah.
Yeah.
And and
Well, we
and I,
are.
I but I'm also optimistic that something different and better will emerge from
Yeah.
the other side of this. But it's not. I don't think we're in for an easy time. So
Well, I was just researching recently all the old prophecies from the Native Americans, the Kabbalists, the yoga traditions. It's really remarkable. They saw exactly what's happening now. And they saw it as this crucible time for humanity. It's very interesting. I'm going to write about that soon.
how
Um,
did we get so fortunate to live in the crucible times, Nicholas? This is another thing I think about. Like,
it,
wow,
I think it's
wow. I think
extraordinary. I think it's
yeah,
extraordinary, really extraordinary. And we're here. We're here.
lucky us, right? Here we are. So
I don't know about lucky, but it's a remarkable time. Michael, just thank you. Can we see if people would like to talk or ask something? Monica, can you unspotlight us for a moment so we can see everybody? And then anyone who'd like to raise their hand, Asha. Um, Asha, yeah, of course, Asha has been training with me recently. And Liz is there. Hi, Liz. Great to see you. Asha, please. Yeah.
I
Asha,
just want to thank you.
the Gene, Michael.
Yeah, I do. I work with Advocate Health, and when I came to the program in the fall, Jean had just sent me a message about the program
This is
in
my
happenstance,
transformational coaching program.
transformational coaching. And I am not a coach, so that was an interesting experience. But in my work with Nicholas, I am. I really am. I lead a group of people who need me more than ever, and I was one of those people, honestly, who arrived really quite burnt out from the pandemic. And I get emotional as I think about it now because Nicholas described someone. I physically could not sit through some of our sessions. Like it was just very uncomfortable and very somatic. So I would be incredibly exhausted afterwards. I am concerned about what's happening next, but I feel more hopeful for a place for someone like me to lead teams through this time. I am just on the growing edge of my development as a healing leader. If you, and I
Mm,
guess the question I would
mm,
have for you and Nicholas is, we are in the crucible. I certainly feel it. Is there is there a place for me? Will I be able to maintain? I now know that I am called to do this work without a shadow of a doubt. So how do I navigate exponentially now through the next 6 months to a year in an environment particularly in healthcare, that is rapidly evolving through AI? And what advice would you give someone like me who wants to continue the journey? And how do I navigate staying in it, where people are starting to look at aligning structures, restructuring, looking at spaces to eliminate additional leadership? How do I survive during this time?
Mm.
Mm. Maybe just an initial shot. I should first of all thank you. Advocates are, an organization that both Nicholas and I have done a lot of work with. It, to me, the answer that there's a two-part answer to it. One is I tell everyone these days on the technical side of things, you need to embrace AI. You need to be on the leading edge of the AI. You need to understand the tsunami and learn to surf the tsunami of AI, right? And that may seem somewhat inconsistent from the second part, which is really being that fully embodied leader, and devoted and connected leader, and in part helping others through this process, right? To me, both sides of that turn out to be very important now, and it's also advice, by the way, I give my kids, right? Which is, I think that you need to both fully embrace this technology and its possibilities on one hand, and you need to learn to lead differently and more humanly, because that's what remains for us than ever. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. So Asha, having had the privilege of accompanying you, these last 6 months of wonderful learning for all of us, and seeing how much you already moved and how, you shared with us during the program. I mean, my answer won't surprise you in a way. It's to say that to keep doing your inner work. And I love, the 4 avenues Michael outlined earlier: the purpose, path, practice, and people. Purpose, path, practice, and people. Because for all of us, we need to prioritize our inner journey so that we become points of stability, if you like, an ever growing stability within the growing storm, which are going to get worse, I'm sure. Because the answer will never be out there. The answer is always in our own development, and you've done amazingly in the last 6 months. So I would really encourage you to keep that as your first priority, and take time for you. Take time for the practices that enable you to stay in a more centered, grounded space. Yeah, thank you, Asha. Thank you. Liz,
I noticed you had a comment, cheerful comment, Liz, in the
I can.
the chat.
Yes, this may be a rather big one to end on with 5 minutes to go, but I suppose one of the things I'm grappling with is there's this sort of Jem Bendel, civilizational collapses and ecological collapse is on its way. So we need to, or Margaret Wheatley, orient ourselves to that. Or it's like, is there hope? I think if I think there isn't hope, then I'm probably more inclined to eat, drink, and be merry. And yeah, so yeah, I suppose that's something, and it's a hard thing to talk about in most spaces. So yeah.
I'm looking for a particular quote, Liz. Here, I'll read it because I think it actually has a lot to say. It's by Václav Havel. And he said, "Hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out." So what I take from that and from, your comment, is that we have to be anchored in the certainty of an internal identity and doing work that we know makes sense. If our well-being is in any way determined by the outcome of our work, then we're in even bigger trouble. I think that's just totally essential now.
Yeah.
So when people say you hope not, I say it's not even something I think about. It's not, because I have no idea what's going to happen. But I know that the work I do and many other people do just makes total sense, and I love doing it. And I see it has impact in however small circles it does. So
Yeah, I think there's something really important just in what you just said, and I'm just also picking up something Nicholas say. For my children, actually, I wrote something about principles to survive and thrive and what is to come. And I posted it on LinkedIn, but I actually wrote it for my children. And maybe that's it. There's some ideas that are helpful here, right? I think on a global basis, Liz, it's going to be a mess. It's just going to be a mess. And part of what's so hard these days is that we are subjected to every disaster that happens, regardless of where it happens. And I think we're going to see a lot of disasters and maybe stuff that's just extraordinarily awful. But part of the answer to that is to focus more locally on your own community, your own place, your own family, your own connections, your own, and just try to insulate yourself, because disaster is not going to happen everywhere. It's not, right? And it's why I'm a long-term, optimist about humanity, right? Humanity will emerge from this probably very different than it is today. And we probably will see some pretty terrible things. But we have the capacity to create local conditions, I believe, right? That will help lay the foundations for what will come beyond this. And that's the work I see us doing. It's not to worry about the global, but to focus much more on the local in the end. And I sure maybe it's a related point for you too. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. Thank you. Yeah, that was beautiful, Michael, and I think a lovely way to end. So I want to thank you. This has been for me, a very rich dialogue. And thank you to everyone who's attending now, and to those of you who will be listening to the recording. Thank you. Thank you. And see you.
Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to be with us this morning.
Bye-bye.